Hey folks, Skell here. Today I'm presenting my personal D&D 5e Ranger class rework. I know I'm far from the first person to make a Ranger rework, there's a ton of them out there, so in an attempt to stand out from the countless ones that are posted on Reddit, GM Binder, etc., I have decided to make a video showcasing my design and the reasoning behind it. The video will be organized like this. First, I'll cover the main problems and principles that guided my design process. Second, I'll be reading through my reworked version of the Ranger class and elaborating on its features. And third, I'll be addressing some questions and concerns that I anticipate some people might have about my design. Also, if you want to have the actual document open in another tab while you listen along, there'll be a link right at the top of the description of this video. This video assumes that you have a decent familiarity with the vanilla 5e Ranger and its underwhelmingness, but nonetheless, I'll go ahead and briefly review what I see as the Vanilla Ranger's main sore points. Problem number one with the Vanilla 5e Ranger, the lack of a defining core combat feature. Whereas most other classes in 5e have some, iconic feature that defines how they act in combat, like Fighter with their Action Surge, Paladin with Divine Smite, and maybe to a lesser extent Lay on Hands. The Ranger doesn't really have any equivalent to this. They just simply don't really get anything that particularly defines them in combat. Next up, number two, the Ranger's combat effectiveness can be underwhelming, especially at higher levels. The general consensus I've seen from folks playing Ranger is that at lower to mid levels, Ranger is pretty fine at combat. They're not especially amazing, but they do serviceably well. Mainly where they start to fall behind is at the higher levels, 11th level and beyond, kind of. This can probably be attributed partly to the fact that, again, they don't have a core combat feature to scale up with them at higher levels, but also just in general they don't get a lot of other features that help them with combat at the higher levels. Number three, Ranger's utility features are weak, inconsistent, or uninteresting. Probably the most infamous example of this would be favored terrain, how the Ranger has these kind of situational benefits with travel and navigation and such, but only while they're in their specific favored terrain, and otherwise they are no better than anyone else, any other class, at doing quote-unquote Ranger stuff. Also, favorite enemy. Favorite enemy can be kind of fun sometimes, what small benefit that you do get from it. It can be flavorful, but it hinges upon you frequently dealing with your favorite enemies, which can't be guaranteed in many campaigns. So half the time, if not more often, as a Ranger, you're going to feel like you just have non-existent utility features. You're just a fighting style and some spellcasting on two legs. Number four. The Ranger's spellcasting is very limited, especially when you compare it to Paladin spellcasting. Ranger spellcasting isn't awful by any means. It is useful and it can sometimes shine. Ranger does get some cool spells on their spell list, but it just has a lot of little problems that add up to be worse than the sum of its parts. First of all, that you just don't know very many spells. You start with only 2 spells known, and you just get 1 spell every other level from then on out, whereas the Paladin, on average, can prepare more spells at any given time than the Ranger knows, generally. Also, on that note, just the fact that Paladins have the luxury to prepare and re-prepare their spells every day, whereas the Ranger is stuck with their known spells. They can't freely swap them out. Not to mention the fact that Paladin's Oaths, their subclasses, give them a lot of bonus spells, whereas Ranger subclasses either give no bonus spells, such as with the Hunter and the Beastmaster, or in some other cases they give some bonus spells, but it's like half the spells that a Paladin subclass would give. So Ranger is definitely behind in spellcasting by a decent margin. Having discussed what I think are the main problems with the Vanilla Ranger, I want to go over my overarching design principles that guided me in writing my rework. First of all, identify the most iconic themes of being a quote-unquote Ranger, and build mechanics to support these themes. Examples of iconic themes for Ranger being stealthy, being good at tracking, being good at wilderness travel, being hard to surprise, even those sorts of things. I tried to build my class rework such that it could support these and other themes to at least some extent. Note that we can't literally give the class everything Rangers might be known for, or we would end up with this overcomplicated feature-bloated mess. We need to be okay with certain more specific things being left to feats and multiclassing and the like. Next principle, alienate as few potential Ranger players as possible. In other words, don't make a design that is too mechanically or thematically specific such that it wouldn't fit a lot of Rangers. I want my Ranger rework to be usable to as many potential players as possible. I want it to be flexible enough to accommodate many different archetypes. And that means being very careful not to inadvertently exclude a lot of valid Ranger character concepts by just making the base class too specific in its mechanics or theme. Next, keep content clean and simple. This is pretty straightforward. This just means keeping word count relatively low, not introducing too many options and sub-options for the player to agonize over, and just generally making features easy to read and use at the table. This maybe seems like common sense, but I have seen so many well-intentioned Ranger reworks out there that are just kind of a mess. They are just super complicated. Every level or two, you just are presented with like 10 different options to pick from, and it's just, my brain turns off. Last principle I'll cover, keep the Ranger recognizable to its original form. Or in other words, try to rework and recycle existing features wherever possible, and only add as much new stuff as is necessary. Basically, my design assumes that if you're looking for a Ranger rework, you probably liked the overall idea of the original PHP Ranger to at least some extent, but you just want something with better execution of that idea. So I don't want to make too many radical changes in my rework and risk ending up with something that barely resembles what it was meant to improve upon. Now that we've gotten all that out of the way, we can get into the meat of the video, actually reading out the content of my rework. Let's just start with the starting features and proficiencies. There have been some minor quality of life changes to the equipment. I don't think discussing the specifics of it is really worth it, but just know that there's now kind of a wider variety of weapons and armors to choose from to better reflect the Ranger's various proficiencies. Armor proficiencies are the same, weapon proficiencies are the same, saving throw proficiencies are the same, skill proficiencies are mostly the same, other than that now acrobatics is an option, because I don't know how acrobatics wasn't an option to begin with a dexterity-based class. Oh, and hit die is still a d10. That hasn't changed. Now, for the first proper feature in my rework, expertise. At first level, choose 2 of your skill proficiencies. Your proficiency bonus is doubled for any ability check you make that uses either of the chosen proficiencies. At 6th level, you can choose another 2 skill proficiencies to gain this benefit. If it isn't obvious, this is basically the same as the Rogue's expertise, minus the option of Thieves' tools. I very strongly believe that expertise just solves so many problems with the Ranger, and it does so with just minimal word count. First of all, it offers choices to distinguish individual Rangers without needing to introduce a whole lot of complexity. Basically, if you already understand how skills work in 5e, you understand how expertise works. You don't need to really learn anything quote-unquote new to understand it. And also, many skills in 5e just line up really nicely with iconic Ranger traits. Nature and survival are probably the most obvious examples, but also perception can represent awareness and being hard to surprise, stealth for stalking and ambushing, and even athletics for things like climbing and swimming, which some people associate with the Ranger. But skill expertise also allows for less conventional Rangers too. Imagine, for example, history expertise for a Ranger who has traveled many places and accumulated a lot of worldly knowledge. Insight and deception for a smooth-talking bounty hunter who specializes in tracking down wanted humanoids. Or arcana for a Ranger that deals with magical creatures or ones from beyond the material plane. On top of that, because of their very nature, skills represent broad categories of abilities, so they're more likely to see use than completely novel features that only have very specific applications. So expertise is arguably the lazy way out, way to prevent having to write a whole bunch of new features and sub-features, but I would argue that it's just the smart way out. Now, I anticipate that some people are going to have some concerns with quote-unquote stepping on toes of the Bard and the Rogue. A lot of people I have seen are against expertise on Ranger because they think that giving the Ranger expertise will devalue it on the Bard and Rogue. I personally disagree. I think that if you believe that expertise is the key defining feature of Bard and Rogue, you are not giving enough credit to those classes. Those classes get so many other highly distinguishing things for them. Rogue, for example, with sneak attack and cunning action, both very powerful abilities. Bard with their bardic inspiration, their whole spellcasting, Song of Rest. Those classes get so much more than just expertise. Their expertise is just a part of what defines those classes. It's not the main thing. I don't think we need to worry about devaluing the Bard or the Rogue just because expertise goes on one more class. Next feature, Primeval Focus. Your keen instincts and awareness allow you to more reliably land strikes and evade danger. When you miss with an attack roll, you can grant yourself a bonus to the roll equal to 5 plus your wisdom modifier, potentially turning the miss into a hit. Alternatively, if you are hit by an attack while you're not incapacitated, you can grant yourself a bonus to AC equal to 5 plus your wisdom modifier for that attack, no action required, potentially causing it to miss. Once you use this feature, whether to enhance an attack or your AC, you can't use it again until you finish a short or long rest. The number of times you can use this feature before a rest increases with your Ranger level. 2 uses at 5th level, 3 uses at 11th level, and 4 uses at 18th level. Regardless of your number of uses, you can't add this feature's bonus to the same attack roll, or your AC, multiple times at once. So if it's not obvious, this is my completely new core combat feature that was missing from the original Rangers, analogous to Fighter's Action Surge or Paladin's Divine Smite. When designing this feature, I knew that this was going to define every Ranger, so it needs to be flavorful but not overly specific in its theme and usage. Again, the goal is to alienate as few Rangers as possible with my design. So I tried to find the least common denominator of all Rangers, and I came up with 2 things. Thing 1, hitting things good, and thing 2, avoiding getting hit good. That sounds silly and kind of dumb, but I don't think anyone will say, "Well, sorry, but I just don't think my dexterity-based martial character fits these concepts." This is my hope that basically every Ranger can get behind this and be like, "Yep, that's me. That's what my guy does." I think Primeval Focus is a very simple feature to understand and use and play. It's just adding a flat bonus to a roll or to your AC, and that's important for foundational class features, them being simple and easy to use. As for balance concerns, the numbers feel kind of big. 5 plus your wisdom modifier. On the average Ranger, that's going to be like +7, +8 in total. But I think the impact of these big numbers is ultimately limited. The feature will only ever let you do what was technically already possible if you had just rolled a bit better, or if your enemy had rolled a bit worse. It doesn't let you do anything truly extra, like Action Surge. Like, you can use Action Surge to try again after a miss, but you can also use Action Surge to hit and then hit a second time. Primeval Focus doesn't offer anything like that kind of benefit. Also, why I think the numbers are reasonable, I compared against some similar features, like War Cleric's Channel Divinity Guided Strike, which is just a +10 bonus to an attack roll, Battlemaster Fighter's Precision Attack, which is add a superiority die to an attack roll, and even the Shield spell, which is +5 AC, not just against one attack, but for a whole round, albeit costing your reaction and a spell slot. Next, Natural Explorer, the first feature we've come across so far that is a rework of what was an existing feature in the original Ranger. Accustomed to wild, untamed environments, you move and traverse long distances with exceptional ease. Climbing and swimming don't cost you extra movement. In addition, you receive the following benefits while traveling. You can move stealthily while traveling at a normal pace, instead of only at a slow pace. Even when you are engaged in another activity while traveling, such as foraging, navigating, or tracking, you remain alert to danger. You have advantage on saving throws against exhaustion caused by prolonged or otherwise strenuous travel, such as during a forced march. For rules on traveling and related activity, see Chapter 8 of the Player's Handbook. Now, the climbing swimming speed wasn't there before in Natural Explorer. It was something I added as a kind of consolation prize in case you never get to use the travel benefits, because nowadays wilderness travel is kind of a niche thing in D&D. Not a lot of campaigns focus heavily on it, so basically anytime you design a feature that focuses on wilderness travel, you need to acknowledge that it just might not come up in a campaign. You can't really assume that it's going to have any sway one way or the other on balance. And even climbing and swimming speed is kind of a modest feature. Depending on your DM or your campaign, climbing and swimming may come up in combat only very rarely, so being able to do either faster will only matter a handful of times, if ever. Nonetheless, climbing and swimming feels cool and it's thematically appropriate, and it even calls back to the Ranger's climbing and swimming abilities in 3.5e. As for the travel sub-features, those now apply regardless of favored terrain. Favored terrain just doesn't exist anymore, and some of them have been revised. A couple of the original sub-features were reused or reworked, some of them were cut, and a new one was added. There are a couple of reasons why some of the old sub-features were removed. For one, some of the features were kind of redundant with other things. For example, the old double foraging sub-feature was kind of redundant if you had the Outlander background, which just gave you what was basically a better foraging feature. You don't really need better tracking abilities if you take, say, survival expertise, which is going to make you do better on tracking checks anyway. Other main reasons some sub-features were removed was because the sub-features removed challenge and depth from travel. Like the sub-feature that meant you never got lost by non-magical means. The sub-feature that meant that you just ignored difficult terrain for you and your entire party while traveling. That removes a lot of interesting elements from travel. Isn't part of the thrill of wilderness travel that you have to deal with the possibility of getting lost, and that you're going to have to account for certain factors such as difficult terrain and other obstacles? I just think that some of those old sub-features didn't have any place being part of Natural Explorer. Lastly, the final sub-feature in my reworked version is the Exhaustion sub-feature, which amends what I think feels like an oversight, which is that even though they're the class you would expect to be the most enduring for long periods of travel, they don't have any mechanics to back that up. So this is just a small, simple thing I thought filled that gap. Next, fighting style has been kept the same from the Vanilla Ranger. I haven't touched the fighting styles at all, so we can just go ahead and move right on to spellcasting. To save us a lot of time here, I'm not going to read out the entirety of the spellcasting feature. I'm just going to summarize the changes I've made relative to the Vanilla Ranger. First of all, you start with one extra spell known, so you just have one extra spell known for your entire Ranger career, obviously to alleviate the problem of Ranger having very limited flexibility in their spells, often feeling compelled to take the must-have spells, quote-unquote, such as Hunter's Mark, and not picking some of the more niche but interesting spells. This should hopefully go at least some ways in alleviating those problems. Also, just while we're on the topic of spells known, I know that I could have gone the way of making the Ranger use prepared spells instead, like Paladin, but I like the idea of Ranger spellcasting feeling distinct from Paladins. This is not to say I think the Ranger spellcasting should be strictly inferior to the Paladins, which brings us to the next main change, the addition of ritual casting. Ranger, weirdly enough, has a lot of ritual spells on their spell list, despite not being a ritual caster. In fact, I think out of all of the non-ritual casters in the game, they have the most ritual spells on their spell list by a big margin. So I thought, oh hey, adding ritual casting would be a nice way to give a little bit of a buff to some of Ranger's lesser used utility spells that are rituals, but also a good way to distinguish the Ranger spellcasting from the Paladin, because the Paladin doesn't have ritual casting. The next change is the addition of Druidic Focus as an option for spellcasting. This is not really a balance change, it's just a quality of life change, because if Paladins get to use holy symbols, I think it's only fair that Rangers get to use a Druidic Focus if they want. Lastly, for the spellcasting, I have added an optional expanded class spell list that you can use if you want. Kind of like the addition of the Druidic Focus, this is not really meant to be a huge buff to the class. It's more intended to be a quality of life change that better enables the ranger to lean into certain archetypes that people associate with the ranger. For example, being a scout, being able to use spells to gather information, being stealthy, which the invisibility spell, for example, would let you do. Elemental magic also, I've added a few more elemental spells. I would be very curious to know what people think of the spells I have added, if they think that any of them aren't a good fit, if they think there's something blatant that's missing that should be on the ranger spell list. Either way, I would be very happy to get some feedback on that. On to the next feature, Unwearied Journey. This is yet another entirely new feature written up by me. Starting at 2nd level, your tireless will and resilience help you to weather extended periods of adventuring. Whenever you spend one or more of your ranger hit dice to regain hit points, you add a bonus equal to 2 plus your wisdom modifier, minimum of +1, to the number of hit points you regain from each die. Similar to Primeval Focus, this is another gap-filling feature. At 2nd level, the vanilla ranger, gets nothing besides their fighting style and their spellcasting, whereas the paladin gets those things plus divine smite, which is, kind of a big deal. I didn't think it would be acceptable to just leave ranger with nothing at this level. I feel like so long as paladin gets their fighting style, spellcasting, and divine smite, ranger is just going to feel kind of naked without having something extra at 2nd level. Unwearied Journey is meant to be a modest but still significant boost to survivability, especially across longer days filled with lots of small combats, which I think a lot of people would expect the ranger to be the best at out of any class. I would say maybe in terms of power, Unwearied Journey is slightly weaker than the fighter's Second Wind. My reasoning being that while Unwearied Journey will situationally grant you more hit points per day than Second Wind, Unwearied Journey is also considerably less flexible than Second Wind. Since you can use Second Wind basically whenever you want, you can guarantee that you'll be getting its extra hit points the moment you need them most. For example, in the middle of a really tough combat. With Unwearied Journey, you're at the mercy of if and when you take a short rest. It improves your survivability across full adventuring days, but the benefit within any individual combat is less reliable. Despite its limitations, I think this is a cute little feature. I think it feels psychologically satisfying just when you're at a short rest to know that with every hit die you roll, you're getting a pretty sizable chunk of hit points added on. And it helps reinforce the theme of the class being able to endure kind of long, tedious stretches of challenge. Moving on to 3rd level. Ranger archetypes have been kept the same. My reworked class is designed to work with the ranger subclasses as they exist. You don't need to make any modifications to a ranger subclass just to get it to work with my own reworked ranger, really. That said, I am exploring making revised versions of a couple of the subclasses, so maybe that will be a different video, who knows. What is new, however, is Land Stride. Starting at 3rd level, moving through non-magical difficult terrain costs you no extra movement. You can also pass through non-magical plants without being slowed by them and without taking damage from them if they have thorns, spines, or a similar hazard. In addition, you have advantage on saving throws against plants that are magically created or manipulated to impede movement, such as those created by the Entangle spell. Once you reach 9th level, even magical difficult terrain doesn't cost you extra movement to move through. So if you're familiar enough with the Vanilla Ranger, you probably can see that this is 95% the same as the Vanilla Ranger's Land Stride, but with a couple of key differences. First of all, that the original Land Stride came at 8th level, whereas I have moved it all the way down to 3rd level. I think the benefit that Land Stride gives is pretty nice. I think being able to ignore difficult terrain in combat can be situationally very, very useful, but a lot of combats difficult terrain simply doesn't come up, and this feature doesn't help you. So I think 3rd level is a reasonable point to give a feature like this. The other main change is the little improvement at 9th level that lets you ignore magical difficult terrain too. It just felt like a logical addition to help the ranger keep up with other classes as they face more and more magical threats at the higher levels. Ability score improvements remain unchanged from the Vanilla Ranger. They come at the same levels. They do the same thing. Now, this next thing isn't a formal class feature, but I still think it is worth mentioning. As you've probably noticed, there is no favored enemy feature in my reworked Ranger. However, I've included this little sidebar here for backstory inspiration because I do know that favored enemy is important to a lot of Rangers. I'll get into why I don't think it needs to be a formal class feature later on, but for now, the short of it is, I don't think favored enemy needs to be a feature with a lot of mechanical support. I think it can just be a backstory thing of, hey, some Rangers have favorite enemies. Talk to your DM about your favorite enemies if you want to. Consult with your DM and see what special information you might have about your favorite enemies that might be relevant to the campaign. At 5th level, extra attack has been kept exactly the same. Moving up a few levels, Traceless. Starting at 8th level, you can't be tracked by non-magical means, unless you choose to leave a trail. This is simply the anti-tracking part of the Vanish feature from the Vanilla Ranger, minus the bonus action hide bit. This feature is not really impactful in most campaigns, because, let's face it, when are the PCs ever being tracked? But it feels thematic and cool, so I decided it was worth leaving in. That said, why remove the bonus action hide from the class when it's a popularly desired feature for the Ranger? I've seen a lot of people who want bonus action hide and think it should be part of the Ranger's base kit. My reasons for deciding it wasn't worth keeping in is mainly that the original Vanish feature came online so late at 14th level. So it didn't really matter to most Rangers anyway. Not a lot of people play at that high of a level, so I'm not functionally changing that many people's builds by getting rid of this bonus action hide. And also, if you really wanted to hide as a bonus action, you probably already multi-classed 2 levels into Rogue, so you didn't have to wait an entire 14 levels for it, you know? Moving on another few levels. Feral Senses. At 10th level, you gain preternatural senses that help you locate and attack unseen enemies. You can take the search action as a bonus action on each of your turns. In addition, when you attack a creature you can't see, your inability to see it doesn't impose disadvantage on your attack rolls against it. So Feral Senses in the Vanilla Ranger was originally at 18th level, and I've moved it down here all the way to 10th level, where I personally think its strength as a feature feels more appropriate. You know, Feral Senses has always been cool as a feature. It's far from useless, but it never struck me as strong enough to justify it being at 18th level. And as you've probably noticed, it is replacing the old hide in plain sight feature from the Vanilla Ranger at 10th level, which in my opinion was a very, very underwhelming feature that I don't miss having. Now, I've also changed Feral Senses itself a little bit, besides just moving its level. Namely, I got rid of this extra clause from the original Feral Senses that went, quote, "You are aware of the location of any invisible creature within 30 feet of you, provided that the creature isn't hidden from you, and you aren't blinded or deafened." This sub-feature from the original Feral Senses was just functionally useless. It did nothing. Hidden as a game term means unseen, unheard, and thus location unknown. So if an invisible creature isn't hidden from you, that implies you already can hear it or see it somehow, or you just otherwise know where it is, which means you know its location. Which means, what? Exactly. This feature is self-defeating. It doesn't make any sense. So I went ahead and went with something that is actually consistently useful for locating invisible creatures, which was adding the ability to search as a bonus action. So, you know, that way on your turn you could, without needing to spend your entire action doing it, you could just as a bonus action try to find an invisible creature, find them, and then use your action to attack them, for example. Next, Weird Prescience. By 14th level, you've developed an inexplicable ability to foresee impending peril and ready your defenses in a split second. So long as you aren't incapacitated, any critical hit against you becomes a normal hit. In addition, you can't be surprised except when you're incapacitated by something other than natural, non-magical sleep. If you're sleeping naturally when combat begins, you awaken just before initiative is rolled. This is another totally new feature that is meant to help strengthen the ranger a bit at higher levels. The anti-critical hit part should be obvious in its utility. Think about all those clutch instances that happen in combat where one of the party members is doing fine, they took a hit, but they're doing fine, and then suddenly something crits them, and they roll near max damage, and now they are just on the ground dying. With this feature at 14th level, you just don't have to worry about that happening anymore. That is pretty nice insurance to have, I think. As for the anti-surprise part, it admittedly comes a bit late compared to, say, the Barbarian, who gets something kind of similar at 7th level, but if you really want a feature that negates surprise at earlier levels, you have the option to grab the alert feat and get some other powerful benefits with that feature too. So I'm not too fussed about this anti-surprise thing coming late, because if you really, really want it, you can get it earlier by just getting the right feat. Finally, moving on to the capstone of the class, Ranger Lord. At 20th level, whenever you start your turn in combat with no uses of Primeval Focus remaining, you regain 1 use. Now, by this point, you are already going to have 4 uses available of Primeval Focus per short rest. So you might think, what's the use of having it regenerate at the start of your turn? Or vice versa, what's the use of having 4 uses of it if it just regenerates at the start of your turns anyway? Well, for one thing, having the 4 uses built up does let you go Nova, quote-unquote, at the start of a fight, just where you expend all of your uses of Primeval Focus within the first round or two, so that way you can hit and dodge as many attacks as possible. And then after that, after you've spent all of the uses like within the first round or two, you then have 1 use per round for the rest of the fights. In that sense, it kind of functions like the old Foe Slayer capstone, but as you can probably see, it's a lot better. Admittedly, I've not really done much high-level play, so I would be very curious to see what people who have played at around 20th level think of this feature, if it seems too good or not good enough. Now, having read all the way through my reworked Ranger, I'd like to address a couple of questions and concerns I've anticipated ahead of time regarding my design choices. Concern number 1. Why no Hunter's Mark-like class feature? A lot of homebrew Rangers go this route. Even Wizards of the Coast's own Tasha's Cauldron of Everything presents an alternate class feature that works like this. Personally, I have a lot of reasons why I'm not a fan of the concept. Primarily, it's that not all Ranger players are invested in the idea of dealing high sustained damage to a single target. For example, a Hunter Ranger with the Hordebreaker feature. And that's a huge problem, having a core class feature that would alienate a lot of prospective players. Earlier versions of my Ranger had a Hunter's Mark-like feature, but because of this fundamental problem, I ultimately scrapped it and replaced it with what is now Primeval Focus, a feature that is much less likely to feel out of place on any given Ranger. Concern number 2. Why get rid of Favorite Enemy? I got rid of Favorite Enemy as a core class feature for a couple different reasons. First, not all Ranger players care much about Favorite Enemies. Sure, for many Rangers, their favorite enemies are a critical part of their backstory and motivations. But I've also seen plenty of Rangers whose favorite enemies were just an afterthought. Something that was only written down because the player felt obligated to have it, regardless of whether it made much sense for the character. Second, the original favorite enemies feature barely even offered anything of substance to the class. It was a ribbon that made you a bit better at knowing and doing stuff related to your enemies. You know, the kind of benefit most DMs would give you just for having a decently fleshed out backstory that involves a past enemy. This is why in my Ranger I repurposed Favorite Enemy from a formal class feature to a sidebar with optional backstory inspiration, because, functionally, it was little more than that to begin with. Concern number 3. Why not adapt Favorite Enemy or Favorite Terrain to have stronger, more broadly useful benefits? Examples of this I've seen around are things like, you have poison resistance if your favorite terrain is swamp, you have advantage on saving throws against being charmed if your favorite enemy is Fey, things like that. Again, a lot of homebrew Rangers go this route, but I think it has some problems associated with it. Partly for the same fundamental reason that I'm not very satisfied with Favorite Enemy in general, as I just explained, but also because it seems like a huge pain to keep all the options balanced and equally interesting, especially since they're all expected to be core to the class, and thus need to be really robustly designed or the whole class will just not really work. I'm not sure that pulling it off would even be realistically possible. Or at least, I've yet to see another ranger design pull it off in a way that felt satisfying to me. Well, we're coming up on the end of the video now, so I'll wrap up by saying that I would love to see your thoughts and feedback in the comments if you have any. I don't mind if you write a couple sentences on a single aspect of the design, or a small essay's worth covering a lot of things. As long as you're being thoughtful and constructive, I'm fine with anything you have to offer. Thank you for watching, and happy ranging!